So today's talk is called It's Nothing But I Think It Works. What is the placebo effect? Before I start the talk, some standard housekeeping, which is that you're all watching this on Facebook or through Eventbrite. Please put your likes and comments and questions into the Facebook chat. I don't know if people on Eventbrite can submit questions, which is a shame, but unfortunately we don't have a way around that. You can always email us. You'll see our email address later on. But any questions, I will answer them at the end of the talk. If you're a tweety person, then could you please tag me, and those are the hashtags, the Brain Guy and our talks. And here are our various social media accounts, so take your pick and tweet away, etc. For some of you, this will be your first talk that you're attending of mine. For many of you, welcome back. This is talk number 20. I gave 14 talks last year, and then this is the 6th talk of this year. All of the talks after I've given them, they are recorded, edited, and then uploaded onto my YouTube channel. And so if you want to see any of my previous talks, please go to my YouTube channel. And if you subscribe for free to the channel, you will get a notification every time a new talk is uploaded. I want to say welcome to all my friends around the world. We've got quite a lovely following from many different countries, so welcome back to you all. And these are the countries that I think you represent. If we've not got your country, then please do tell us so that we can paint a bit more red onto this. And before I start the talk formally, I'd like to thank my wonderful team, which is expanding. I'm so fortunate that all these talented young people want to work with me, and without them, I wouldn't be able to put this on. Francesco, who I just mentioned, who's just found out about 20 minutes ago that he's got this PhD place. He's the young man in the top right-hand corner. And I'd also like to single out Chun Lim Pan, who is on the extreme left. Chun Lim is in Malaysia, and he has helped me put together this talk. So thank you to Chun Lim. Okay, as an overview for the talk, what I'm going to tell you about is what is this thing called a placebo, then that big issue that size does actually matter. Then I'll talk about what scientists do to try to deal with this placebo effect, and try to go into what explanations there are for the placebo effect. And we don't really know, we just know it exists. And then finally, I'm going to tell you whether there are any positive aspects, because the placebo effect is usually seen as a negative thing, but maybe there are some positives to it that may be useful. So that's the general overview. Okay, so anyone for a nerd alert? No, I didn't know either. This is a nerd alert. And these are totally focused soft chews with theanine and caffeine. And yes, they're from a wonderful Goop, the company founded by the not great actress Gwyneth Paltrow. And on the product details, it says, "Say goodbye to brain fog. Each bite-sized nerd alert chew gives you a mental boost with 2 nootropics, cognitive supporters, L-theanine and caffeine. As a pair, they're more effective at improving scores on tests of memory, accuracy, and attention than either ingredient alone." Well, I'm sold. Okay, and if you wanted this wonderful thing that's going to give you this mental boost, it's only going to cost you $55 for 30 chews, I think it is. Now, some of you will have seen my talk, Never Mind the Neurobollocks, and this is basically bordering on neurobollocks. Now, this is a statement from their own website. It says, these statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. So having just told you how these nootropics, cognitive supporters, really effective at improving scores of memory, etc., basically their own website says, we don't have any evidence for this whatsoever. Okay, so the reason I picked this, apart from the fact that I find everything with this company and products, etc., appalling, is that it helps me move into this talk. The conversation is a publication in the UK, which has scientists write for the layperson. And so whenever something comes out in the scientific news, some scientist will write something, but not for other scientists to read, but for lay people to read. So there was an article in this and about Goop, and here's a line from it. Goop exploits the placebo effect, blurring the line between scientific research and folk knowledge to attain credibility. Scientific concepts such as blood platelets, microdosing, quantum theories, double slit experiment, molecules, and subatomic particles are used to validate the therapies canvassed in the series. And this is a series on Netflix about Goop. So what we have here is our entry point into this placebo effect. And this, like a lot of things that can happen with the placebo effect, tend to be about money or people being duped. Not always so, but it can be used for duping people. So what is a placebo? Well, in 1572, the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne said, there are men on whom the mere sight of medicine is operative. And what he was saying is that there are some people for whom everything works. They just get cured or feel better, etc. So what's going on here? The American Society of Pain Management Nursing defines a placebo as any sham medication or procedure designed to be void of any therapeutic value. So in modern parlance, a placebo has been created to not have an active ingredient in it. Usually it's a sugar pill or something like that. And I'll talk a tiny bit more about that later on. But in scientific studies, a placebo has been developed with the knowledge that there's no known therapeutic value of that, because it's usually been developed to try to compare against something else, like a coronavirus vaccine or something like that. So this is from the American Society of Pain Management Nursing. I really like this quote from Christian Jarrett, who's a really lovely writer for the British Psychological Society. He calls the placebo effect an apparently incontrovertible demonstration of the near magical power of mind over matter. It's not literally magic, of course. Our beliefs are the subjective echo of physical processes in the brain. And it's this constellation of neurochemical and electrical events and their downstream effects that underlies the placebo phenomenon. And I really like that, that clause, subjective echo of physical processes in the brain. So this feeling of this works, yes, I'm feeling better, I'm enjoying this, etc. That's at the end of a number of different processes that are biological, biochemical, etc., etc. So there is something happening. We don't understand what it is, but as you'll see, it definitely is there. So lots of research has been done in this area just to see whether it even works. And I'm going to start with just some findings of to demonstrate how robust this is, which means that you could do this over and over again and you would get the same findings. And apparently size does matter. So if I was to give you these two sugar pills and let's say they're made of sugar and said that they would help you with your headache, the one on the right would help your headache more than the one on the left, even though they're just sugar. So science or research has demonstrated that if you give a big one, you'll get a big response. So people seem to think that a larger pill carries more benefit to it. Shape has an impact. So if I gave you round pills or more lozenge type tablets, the lozenge type tablets apparently result in more of a placebo effect. So the improvement that people get from the type of pill on the right hand side is bigger than from the boring round little guy. Outer coating seems to make a difference. So out of these two, same shape or similar shape, but the fancy coating on the pills on the right-hand side results in them giving a bigger placebo effect. So there's something that convinces people that those pills with the shiny fancy stuff on the outside must be better. Even method of administration. So a pill versus an injection, you end up with a bigger placebo effect, even if the injection has got just saline, so just a water solution. So the way that you give a placebo has an impact. So what we see here is that there's something happening with the visual perception, the information coming in of this apparent cure or treatment, and that is having an impact upstairs, which is having an impact elsewhere in terms of the way people feel. There's also impacts of branded names, and this is rather important for marketing. So if you say that this is a generic painkiller, you're going to have a smaller effect than if you say that this is Nurofen. So just the name, if it's well known, will result in a bigger effect. And this is a study, I don't know, I can't remember where it was done, but what they did is that they gave people medication, and they wanted to look at the side effects. And some of the people got a branded painkiller, I think it was, maybe Nurofen or something like that. And some people got a generic one, so it just said painkiller. And half of the people in the branded version had actually an active pill, so there's the gray bars, and half of them had a placebo. So although it said Nurofen on the outside, it was just a placebo pill. And the first thing is that there was a bigger change in pain management for the people who had this active pill, because you would expect that if it's a painkiller, you would expect an improvement in pain management. But what you see with the placebo is that you still end up with that effect, which is the placebo effect. But the important thing is that you've got a bigger one for the branded version. The generic one does not have the same effect. So if you have a generic pill, you end up with a smaller effect of the drug. And in this particular graph, it's a complicated graph, but the main take home from this graph is that if you take a generic pill, you'll end up complaining more of any negative side effects. If it's a fancy name, Nurofen, etc., you're not going to complain about any side effects. But if it's a cheap looking substance, you will end up saying, oh God, this one has left me feeling a bit dry mouth, etc., etc. So your perception of the side effect is greater if it's a cheap sounding brand. So names, labels, the packaging seems to have an impact. And rather amazingly, the color of the pill has an impact as well. So lots of research, and they've shown it all around the world, that the color of the pills will have an impact depending on what you're trying to do. So if the pill is for pepping people up and giving them a boost, then vibrant colors like red and orange, etc., tend to work better. If you're trying to calm people down, then more sedate colors, uh, white and blue, etc., tend to have an impact. So depending on the kind of congruency between the color and the mood you're trying to get, you'll have a bigger placebo effect. Now, rather amazingly, one of the findings is that blue pills end up generally give more of a sedative effect to people. So people tend to feel calmer if they have a blue pill, unless you're an Italian male. If you're an Italian male, it doesn't have quite the same sedative effect. Italian women, yes, they end up having a sedative effect, but not Italian men, because their football team are known as the Azzuris, the Blues. And so for most Italian men who are really into their football, the color blue gets them excited and passionate, which is not what you want when you're trying to sedate someone and calm them down. So you can see how this simple thing of the color of this pill actually has an impact because of a societal attitude towards that color. So even though there's actually nothing in these pills, there's still sugar, the color of the pill can have an impact on the response that you get out of people. A really important thing is that this placebo effect is growing. So these researchers, they've looked at responses across a number of decades in American clinical trials of neuropathic pain, so pain to do with nerve signals, etc., etc. And so they've tracked studies and looked at the statistics within the studies for the pain ratings for different conditions, etc. And the ins and outs aren't important, but the main thing is that if you look from 1990 to 2014, when the study was completed and then published in 2015, what you see is a flat line, which basically means that the amount of pain that people were feeling that was being reported in these publications wasn't changing. However, the placebo response has become bigger. So the change from baseline, which means how much people are changing from not having an effect to having a placebo effect, is actually changing. So there are obviously mechanisms in society that are contributing to this. Maybe it's advertising, maybe it's people's knowledge of information, because now that they've got Dr. Google, they can look things up and become an expert on things and know that such and such a thing is really good for you, like the goop stuff, etc., and what the negative effects are, etc. So maybe it's the rise of the internet, availability of information, and therefore availability of useless information, which is causing this increase in the placebo effect. So this is not just a silly thing. This is an important thing, because this is going to impact the way that people respond to drugs, etc., etc. Now, what do scientists try to deal with this placebo effect? Because when they're trying to look at drugs, vaccines, like the coronavirus vaccine at the moment, they need to know whether this particular drug or vaccine is having the effect that they've designed it to. Because if you've designed something to reduce headaches, you want it to reduce headaches, and you don't want it to cause negative effects, etc., etc. So typically what they do is to have these randomized trials where you get, so we start on the left-hand side, you get your sample, and there are statistical ways to decide how many people you'll have in a sample. And in clinical trials, they'll try to get hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved so that they can cover all the main demographics. And then they'll randomize people through throw of a dice or whatever in, let's say, into two groups. This is the simplest type of design, but it will suffice for what we're going to do. So they'll randomly put people into either group 1 or group 2. And they will give one of those groups, in this case, group 1, this new treatment. Let's call it the coronavirus vaccine. And they'll give another group, the control group, a placebo, something else. And where we're talking, it'll be the placebo. And they will then track them and monitor the outcomes. So in the coronavirus example, for example, what they would be looking at is measuring the level of antibodies that are produced in response to the vaccine, because that is what you want the vaccine to do, to create this defense against the virus if it was to come at you. And what they would do, or what they would expect in this sort of design, where they've randomized people between the treatment and the control, is that the people in group 1 would produce lots of lovely, healthy antibodies to fight the virus if it came at them, and the people in the control treatment not to produce those. So that's the way that a randomized trial works. Now, there are some concerns about the ethics of this, because group 2 are not getting a treatment, and is it fair for them not to get a treatment, etc. These things are catered for in most studies, in that usually what would happen in a trial like this is that if they realized that the treatment was working, they'd shift everyone in group 2 to the treatment. So if it's for something really important, then they would make sure everyone got it anyway. But this is at the early stages of trying to work out whether the treatment works or not. So there's some ethical concerns about this, about giving people a placebo, etc., etc. Now, there are some methods to try to overcome this, and one of them is known as an open label placebo, where everyone who is getting the placebo knows they're getting the placebo. And so it's not that you're trying to dupe them. They know that this is a placebo, then they're not getting anything, an active ingredient. But rather interestingly, it's found that despite this, people can still end up with positive effects. Now, this is a constellation of people who are all at Harvard Medical School, and a sign of how important the placebo effect is that Harvard Medical School, one of the most important medical schools in the whole world, they've got a dedicated unit looking at the placebo effect. So this isn't just kooky stuff. It is real science, because they need to understand why it's working. And the fact that you have all those effects to do with the size of the pill, the color, etc., demonstrates that there's something happening. And although we don't know what it is, we know that something is. And that first author, Ted Kapchuk, seems to be the big guy in this field. So in this study, and it was a randomized trial of patients who had irritable bowel syndrome, they had 3 groups, a waiting list, which basically were the people like in group 2 who were not getting anything, a second group who got limited information, and then the third group, which is called the augmented group, who got more information. And the details aren't important, but what they did is that they tracked people over a certain amount of time. And what they found is that even though the limited group didn't get that much more than the waiting list, they still ended up with higher ratings in terms of improvements in their symptoms, etc. The augmented group got a very high rating, even though no one was getting anything. No one was getting any treatment, but the suggestion of a treatment, even from that limited group, resulted in a bit of a bump. And then the augmented group, who were getting lots of information, this is going to help you like this, etc., just literally giving all of that information resulted in more of an effect. So there's something here. So even when people know that there's a placebo, there's still some sort of positive effect coming on. So, what positive effects could we have? This is a really interesting study using a surgical example. And this is effects of perceived treatment and quality of life and medical outcomes in a double-blind placebo surgery trial. Now, double-blind is a really rigorous method. In the chart I showed you earlier, we had group 1 who got the treatment and group 2 didn't get the treatment, and we had some sort of outcome. In a double-blind placebo trial, even the people who are doing the evaluations at the end, they don't know which group someone is in. Now, the reason for this is that they don't want the people who are doing the evaluations and scoring all of the data, etc., to know whether person A got the treatment or not. And that's a way to make sure that there's no bias on the side even of the researchers. So part of the placebo or the randomizing is to make sure that the individual who is participating doesn't create what we call demand characteristics, and they start kind of feeling better because they think they should. But the double-blind bit means that even the scientist doesn't know, and everything is anonymized, so that the scientist doesn't even know whether this person has got the treatment or not. So this is a surgical study to do with Parkinson's, I think it was. And what they had is that they had a group that had a transplant, and they were told that they were getting having stem cell transplant, and then another group having what's known as sham surgery. So sham surgery is the equivalent of the sugar pill. A sham surgery is where they do the surgery, but they don't actually do anything. So it looks like the surgery, they do everything, but they don't actually put any stem cells in there. Now, importantly, in this graph, what we see is people's changes in physical functioning over time from baseline, which is at the time before any surgeries happen, and then 4 months, 8 months, and 12 months afterwards. And here, as the scores go down, so as we slope downwards, that means that there's an improvement. So if you've got someone with Parkinson's, what you want is that you want the graph to go downwards, implying that they've got fewer problems. Now, the important thing here is that those two lines are separating out in the dotted lines, the transplant group, they actually got stem cells. The other group, the sham group, they didn't get any stem cells. And yet what we see here is an improvement in their physical functioning. So someone drilled into their head, they put stuff in, etc., which wasn't stem cells, and yet these people improved in their functioning. The other thing, and this is the weird one, this is the same, but this is where the people were asked, do you think you had transplant or do you think you had sham surgery? So this is about the perception of the person who had the treatment, because they didn't know themselves. And what we see here is that the people who thought they'd had the surgery, who thought they'd had the transplant, they seem to have much more improvement than the people who'd had this sham surgery. So if people believed that they'd had proper stem cells put in, then irrespective of whether they had or not, they seem to improve. And if they thought, oh, I think I was in the sham group, I don't think they gave me anything, then they didn't improve as much. And this is the remarkable thing. Patients with Parkinson's disease who undertook a form of placebo brain surgery, supposedly but not really involving the injection of stem cells, showed greater symptom improvements than those patients who received the stem cell treatment but didn't think they had. So people who'd had stem cell research, but who thought, no, I think I was in the sham group. I don't think they put anything in there. They actually didn't show that great improvement. Whereas people who had sham surgery, nothing was inserted, but who believed that they'd had these stem cells inserted, they actually improved. And that is what Christian was saying in the quote right at the beginning about the power of mind over matter. There's something quite powerful happening here. So there are lots of factors involved here. And an important thing, which psychologists have been tackling for the last 20 years or so, generally in psychology, is that we're all different. We have individual differences. And one of the big things is personality. And what's been found is that personality has an impact on the propensity to being affected by a placebo. So in this study, these researchers looked at people's optimism and whether, if they were given an analgesic to reduce pain, whether if that was a placebo, there was a difference depending on their type of personality. I'm not going to go into the details, but in this study, I think they gave them an ointment for reducing pain or something like that. I can't remember the details, but they don't matter. What they did is that they had a placebo group who they told they're giving them something with pain relief in it, and a control group who were told there's nothing in this. What you've got along the horizontal line where it says -1 SD and +1 SD is basically the spread or variance between people who are high in optimism and those who are low in optimism. What is found is that people who are high in optimism, they end up responding better to a placebo. So that's basically the +1 people, bottom right-hand corner, they end up with much lower pain scores, i.e. the placebo, this cream that's got no active ingredient in it, it still has a positive impact on them. So it seems that someone's personality and their kind of the way they respond to life, let's say, seems to have an impact on the way that they respond to a placebo. Now, this kind of dovetails into what's known as the marketing placebo effect, or as I'd like to say, are those trainers really that fast? Now, we all know that there's lots and lots of branding around, and I showed you earlier that branding has an impact even on painkillers and things like that. So if a young person was to look at some trainers in a shop, you know they're going to go for the Nike ones rather than their own brand ones. That's just going to happen. Now, in study looking at the impacts of energy drinks, they had three different conditions. They had people who got an actual energy drink, people who got a placebo, so it was a drink which had no active ingredient in it to improve their performance, and finally a control who didn't get anything. Now, the important thing they looked at was people's motivation. So they asked people or got people more or less motivated. I can't remember the details, but basically they were able to separate their participants into those who were low motivation and high motivation. So people who were really pumped up to do something and people who just, oh yeah, I can't be bothered. Now, importantly, what they measured afterwards was their blood pressure. So not how did they perform or anything like that, but literally just their blood pressure after taking this drink. What you see with the energy drink is that there's no difference between the low motivation and the high motivation group. So the people who couldn't be bothered, the low motivation group, their blood pressure changed to the same amount as those people who were really pumped and wanted to do it. Whereas in the placebo group, what you find is that the people who are highly motivated, they seem to get really excited and their blood pressure changed quite a bit. Those who weren't motivated, nothing happened. So it seems that the drink didn't have any impact, because we know the drink didn't have any impact, didn't have any ingredients in it, but the perception of the individuals seemed to have an impact on a physical measure, in this case, the blood pressure. So this shows us that people's individual personality, motivation, etc., is having an impact here. Now, those of you who've been following me for a while, and thank you for putting up with me, will know that certainly in the first lockdown, after giving one of these talks, I'd usually go outside and outside my front of my house and meet my neighbors outside for a glass of wine. So I'm not averse to a glass of wine. And my friend Jane and I are actually trying to learn about Southern Italian wines. Now, those of you who don't know much about wine will probably have some stereotypical thoughts that, oh, well, all this talking about wine, is it really as good as they say, etc. Well, apparently there is something to the fact that some of it might be talk. Not all of it, but some of it might be talk. I'm not going to go into the details of this because it's a complicated study, but in the study conducted by these researchers, they gave people a series of wines to drink while they were in a brain scanner, which to me sounds like my type of experiment. And they looked at a part of the brain called the medial orbitofrontal cortex, that basically here. And that part of the brain is known kind of for feel-good stuff. So it's a happy place, let's say. What they found is that they'd set up this experiment such that two of the wines, they'd set them up that sometimes they said, this is a really cheap wine, it's only $5. Sometimes they said, it's a $45 wine. And what they found is that although it was the same wine, and in this case, I think it was a $5 wine, the response was actually different depending on how much they were told it cost. So even though it was a cheap wine, if some people are told it was a $45 wine, that part of the brain that they were monitoring seemed to get quite excited. And then in the lower panel, you've got a $10 wine that was told, they said it was either $10 or $90. Now, the details aren't important. The main thing is that given that the wine itself was the same in the top panel, but the participants were just told it was $5 or $45, being told the wine was more expensive seemed to have an impact on how different parts of the brain were getting excited. And that suggests that what we think we're having actually has an impact on how we respond to it. Okay, the final part of this talk is going to be looking at, is it all bad? Because up till now, I've been talking about the placebo effect as a bit of a nuisance, and things aren't really there, but we think they are, etc. But is it all bad? Now, there is apparently a kind of placebo effect in perceived physical exercises. This isn't real physical exercise, perceived physical exercise. And this is a study conducted at Stanford where they looked at physical activity and mortality, looking at 3 nationally representative US samples. And they effectively looked at how much people thought they'd exercised, not how much they actually exercised, but how much people thought they exercised, and their mortality, so how well they lived, etc. And this is the money shot. They found that individuals' perceptions about their level of physical activity Okay, can you hear me? Unfortunately, my Wi-Fi just dropped out, and so I don't know whether you can hear me yet. I'll just wait for confirmation that you can. Hopefully, I'm coming through. That's never happened before. Oh, well, it's good. Okay, I'm just going to backtrack just in case um, you missed something I said. Okay, so I talked about the fact that with the wine study, we can see that what people think they were drinking had an impact on the response of a certain part of the brain. And then we see research has looked at what people's perception of their physical exercise has on their mortality. So it's a kind of placebo. And so in this study, these researchers looked at large samples of people from across the states, and they looked at their perceived physical activity, so how much they thought they exercised, and their mortality, so in terms of deaths, etc. So here, the important thing is not how much people actually exercise, but how much they thought they exercised, and what impacts that this had on their health and their living. And this is the conclusion. The conclusion is that individuals' perceptions about their level of physical activity strongly predicted mortality, even after accounting for the effects of actual physical activity and other known determinants of mortality. This suggests that perceptions about health behaviors may play an important role in shaping health outcomes. So, this is rather important. It's not saying that just think you're physically active and you'll be fine. But it is saying that people who feel that they are making an effort, etc., they will have some sort of boost, even if they're not doing a huge amount. The fact that they're doing some activity, if they perceive that they're doing quite a lot, that is going to help them somewhat. So this again is mind over matter, and it shows that people's perception of what is happening to them physically, what they're taking in, etc., has an impact on their behavior and their general outcomes. Okay. Now, another area which those of you who've been following me will know that's important to me is cognition, so our mental processes. And the next talk that I'll be giving actually will be on sleep. So this is a study which looked at whether people's ideas about how much sleep they were getting had an impact on their cognitive performance. And what they did in this study is that they allowed people to sleep, but they manipulated whether people got a lot of sleep or not enough sleep. And then afterwards, they tested them on various measures. So the gray bars are for people who were led to believe that when they came into the lab and had a sleep, that they'd had below average sleep. The white bars are for people who had who were told they had above average sleep. So the important thing is, it's not that they actually had above or below average sleep. They were told that this is how much sleep you had. You had below average, you had above average. Now, they looked at different cognitive measures. Um, you don't need to know what these are. The main thing is that for a simple task, known as the digit span, which is just literally how many digits can you remember? And most of us can remember about 7 digits. There's no difference. So the impact of whether you've slept well or not, or your perception of whether you've slept well or not, is minimal on a simple task. But these other tests, COWAT is a standard one where I say to you, um, say as many words as you can beginning with the letter S in 1 minute, and I count how many words you've said. Now, what we see is that for each of these 3 different cognitive tests, which are more difficult than the digit span, People who thought they'd had below average sleep performed worse than people who thought they'd had above average sleep. And what that implies is that people's ideas about their sleep deprivation or not may have an impact on how they're performing in an everyday context in terms of their memory, etc. So people who are thinking that they're constantly sleep deprived might actually be having a negative impact in their own thinking processes. Okay, the final thing here is about trying to harness this placebo effect. So we've seen that the placebo effect is there, like for the people with the irritable bowel syndrome, even though they hadn't yet had any treatment, there was still this impact. So can that be harnessed? So in this study, which I think is again, maybe it's not the Harvard group, maybe it's a Stanford group, they wanted to harness the placebo effect. So they wanted to see the influence of characteristics of the doctor on the placebo response. So they wanted to see whether if the doctor came across as warm and friendly, or if the doctor came across as knowledgeable or not, had an impact on the placebo effect. The design was complicated. I'll try to step you through it. In this particular study, they gave people something that would give them an allergic reaction to something. So they pricked them with something that was set to create an allergic reaction, and these things called wheals. And wheals are the kind of bumps that you get when you get an allergic reaction to something. And they could measure that. So this was a physical measurement, the size of these welts that they got from the thing that was produced. What they did is that they had their doctors, who were basically acting, well, not acting, but they've been told to behave like this. There were doctors who came across as being high in their competency, doctors who came across as high in warmth. There were doctors who came across as high in both warmth and competency, and doctors who came across as low in both competency and warmth. And these doctors either gave people a negative expectation that, yeah, sorry, this is going to hurt and you're going to get a bit of a reaction to this, and positive expectations. Now, what they found, generally speaking, and the money shot is the other two bars on the right-hand side, is that when the participants thought that the doctor was warm and competent, and they gave them positive expectations, they ended up with this wheel, this reaction being quite small, even though it was still a placebo. So there shouldn't have been any difference between the types of reactions their skin had, and yet there was a significant difference depending on the way that the doctor came across to the individual. So this is rather important. And the conclusion that they said from this is that the study suggests that placebo effects should be construed not as a nuisance variable with mysterious impact, but instead as a psychological phenomenon that can be understood and harnessed to improve treatment outcomes. So basically, the comportment and behavior of the doctor is actually an effective ingredient in how someone will respond. Because here, remember, there's no active ingredient given to these people for this medication, and yet you've got a difference in how they respond, which is based purely on what they thought about the doctor. So here, no active ingredients in any of these people, and yet the way that they perceived the doctor to be had an impact on their placebo effect. Okay, it is obvious that this is a really important area of research because if they can find out why this placebo effect is happening, then as shown in the last graph, we can try to harness this and see if it can improve patient outcome, to improve all the active ingredients using the placebo as an active ingredient in treatment. So these are two graphs that Francesco did for me, of a number of publications from the 1970s to today. And the main thing is that there's a massive growth. I've given you in both colors because, as we saw, Italian men don't find blue a calming color. And given that Francesco is really excited because he's just found out that he's got a fully funded 4-year PhD at an amazing university, he's probably not going to be that calm. So those two colors are for Francesco. He did create them, so I thought I should use them both. Okay, so to summarize, even when there's no active ingredient in the treatment, it can have beneficial impact, and that's the placebo effect. There are a number of physical factors as well as personality and behavior factors that impact the strength of this placebo effect. So it exists, but it can be modulated depending on other factors. Now, whilst they can prove to be a nuisance from a research perspective, there are methods such as that open label placebo for overcoming these. And then, irrespective of the cause of the placebo effect, researchers are finding ingredients that can be harnessed for the patient's benefit. Sorry, there's a word missing there. So we can see that this thing exists. We don't understand it yet, but all this research at Harvard, Stanford, etc., is beginning to try to understand this, and therefore this can hopefully be used in the future to actually help people, so that we know there's an active ingredient anyway, but we can bump that up with the placebo effect. Okay. Finally, I just want to say that if you'd like to take part in our research, we're doing lots of research on human memory and dementia. We've developed a test that we think might be able to diagnose dementia earlier than is currently possible. We're doing lots of research on the way the front of the brain manages behavior and is involved in childhood development. And we've got lots of research on face recognition as well. So if you'd like to participate in our research or even want to know about our research, then please do get in touch with us to this email address. We've got many studies going on, so just tell us your name, age, your gender, and if you have any neurological conditions, then let us know. Or even if you've got a cognitive strength or weakness, even strengths, we want to know. These are our social media platforms, and if you want to find out more about my team, then you can visit our website. And if your organization would like me to come and give a talk on any of the subjects that I've spoken about, then do feel free to contact me directly. So all that's left for me to do is to thank you for coming to this talk, putting up with the small technical glitch. The next talk will be probably on sleep and the brain. And I'm going to give myself a week off. And for my choir friends, I'm going to try out a Thursday for a talk. So I'll see you in about 2 weeks' time. And as has become traditional, I'm going to end with a photograph of my mummy, but this time she's going to be joined by my daddy, my late father. Thank you very much. I will be a few minutes just taking a break, and then I will come back to answer questions. Okay, I'm getting some questions coming in, so I'll start answering them. So the first question is from Michael Bayliss, and he's asked, are there possibilities placebo belief can be further refined in the use of aromatherapy and homeopathy? Okay, Michael, I might say something that might displease you. Aromatherapy, I don't have a problem with, but homeopathy, I do have a problem with. I've never seen any scientific evidence for it. And I know one of the world leaders in this field who has demonstrated quite clearly that homeopathy doesn't work. So I would prefer to stay away from the homeopathy thing, because I do think that it's not fair on people. In terms of aromatherapy, I'm sure that it will be having an impact. So my concern would be that homeopathy is simply a placebo effect. Aromatherapy probably could be enhanced with the placebo. Homeopathy is only a placebo, as far as I know. If you want to look him up, his name is Edzard Ernst, and I've seen him speak incredibly eloquently about this. So my answer is kind of. Okay, next question is from another one of our favorite people, Viv Ellis. Hello, Viv. Viv has asked, does the placebo effect work the other way too? If you think a drug isn't going to work, can this diminish the response too? I think it can, yes. There's something which I didn't want to go into just because it can get a bit complicated, which is known as the nocebo effect, which is where the negative side effects of a drug end up being enhanced when someone thinks that it's not going to work. So, so I think that dovetails into your question that people's perception can have that impact, which is rather important because we want people to believe that the medication that doctors, etc., are putting together is going to work for them. And if they're kind of determined that this isn't going to work, then as has been demonstrated, there can be some negative consequences. So I think it's important that we address that. Okay, so for one of the super fans, Jane Antoinette Croucher, she asked, could all of the completely unwarranted doubts being raised about the AstraZeneca vaccine have a negative effect on its efficacy? Speaking as an unvaccinated German, slowly going a bit bonkers with frustration, Jane, I think that can be the case. I guess it depends on how much someone buys into all of the negative press, because if they start doubting it themselves, then as I answered Viv's question, it may have an impact. Now, the thing is that these impacts, they're not on everything. So they don't, placebo effects don't cure people. The placebo effects tend to be for things like people's perception of their pain. And it tends to be for things like their feeling of their quality of life. The physical stuff might still be exactly the same, but because I'm not well enough versed in this, it's difficult for me to state completely. So I think that it's more a perception thing about the way people are reacting from a kind of psychological perspective than their physical outcome. That's what I think. But yes, I think a lot of the negativity around the AstraZeneca virus, certainly for some people, may have a little impact. Then Viv's going for it. She's asked, has anyone tested the placebo effect on animals? There is, in the Christian Jarrett piece, there is something about placebo effects in animals, and I didn't actually read it because I wanted to keep this succinct. But Viv, if you Google Christian Jarrett, Jarrett, Christian, and BPS Research Digest placebo effect, then you'll get the stuff that Christian has written, and in that he talks about animals and the placebo effect. Okay, so I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes in case there's any more questions. And if not, then I will call it a day and look forward to seeing you in about 16 days' time for the next talk. So no more questions have come in, so I'm going to call it a day. Thank you very much. I hope that you enjoyed the talk. I've kept it shorter this time, and I hope that you enjoyed this new format, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks' time. Have a happy Easter. Bye.